The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked, red earth until the very air shimmered with heat. Inside the stagecoach, 6 souls were being baked alive, rattled and jolted in a symphony of creaking leather and groaning wood. Dust, finer than any flour, seeped through every crack and seam, coating tongues, lining nostrils, and painting a uniform layer of grime over every surface. It was a moving purgatory, a slow crawl through a land God had seemingly scoured clean of life and then forgotten. The passengers had long ago exhausted what little conversation they had, succumbing to a sullen, heat-induced silence. Opposite the rear-facing bench sat a preacher, a man named Reverend Miller, whose black coat seemed to absorb all the sun's fury. He clutched a worn Bible in his lap, his lips moving in silent, constant prayer, though whether for salvation or simply for a cool breeze was impossible to tell. Next to him, a portly salesman in a sweat-stained waistcoat, Mr. Abernathy, had given up dabbing his brow and now simply let the perspiration run in rivulets down his fleshy cheeks, his gaze vacant as he stared at the churning dust outside the window. On the forward-facing bench, a young mother, Mrs. Gable, tried to shield her 2 small, unnervingly quiet children from the worst of the jolts. Her face was a mask of weary resignation, her movements economical and drained of all energy as she offered a canteen from which the children took sparing, listless sips. They were all trapped in the same small, stifling box, yet each was utterly alone in their misery. And then there was the man in the corner, the one who seemed least affected by the ordeal. His name was Luke, though no one had asked and he had not offered it. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, folded into the corner of the coach with an unnatural stillness. He wore a long, ash-gray duster, unbuttoned despite the heat, revealing a simple homespun shirt beneath. It was worn and faded, as were the denim trousers tucked into scuffed leather boots. A low-crowned, wide-brimmed hat was pulled down, casting his face in deep shadow, but one could see the firm set of his jaw and the sun creases that fanned out from the corners of his eyes. His hands, calloused and capable, rested on his knees. They were hands that knew work and, likely, trouble. He hadn't spoken a word since boarding at dawn. He just watched the endless, burnt landscape roll by, his presence a silent, solid weight in the carriage. He seemed as much a part of the harsh land as the stoic, flat-topped mesas in the distance. The coach gave a final, violent lurch and groaned to a halt. The dust, for a moment, settled. The driver's gruff voice cut through the shimmering air. Dry Gulch Station. 10 minutes for water. Stay in the shade if you've got any sense. The name was an overstatement. There was no gulch, and the place was far beyond dry. It was little more than a rickety lean-to, a half-empty water trough for the horses, and a well. The salesman and the preacher stumbled out, eager to stretch their legs. However briefly, Mrs. Gable coaxed her children toward the sliver of shade offered by the shed. Luke remained where he was, unmoving, his shadowed eyes fixed on the horizon. That's when she appeared. She came out of the heat haze like a ghost, a slight figure moving with a desperate, hurried energy that seemed impossible in the oppressive stillness. She wasn't walking so much as fleeing toward the coach. Her dress, a simple calico of pale blue, was smudged with grime and torn near the hem, revealing a flash of dusty ankle. Her hair, the color of spun corn husks, had come loose from its pins and fell in tangled strands around her face, matted with the same red dust that covered everything. As she drew closer, the driver intercepted her. A brief, gruff exchange of words, and the glint of a coin passing from her hand to his. He jerked a thumb toward the open coach door before turning his attention back to the horses. The girl paused at the door, one hand clutching a small, worn valise, the other gripping the doorframe as if for support. Her chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, her eyes wide and startlingly green, like moss in a shaded creek bed darted over the remaining occupants. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, searching not for a friend, but for the least immediate threat. Her gaze slid past the empty seats, past the disapproving stare of the preacher returning to the coach, and landed on Luke. He hadn't moved, but he was no longer looking at the landscape. He was looking at her. His face remained in shadow, unreadable, but his attention was absolute. For a long moment, the world seemed to shrink to the space between them, the stifling, dusty air of the carriage, the weight of a dozen unspoken questions. The other passengers began to climb back in, grumbling about the heat. Reverend Miller settled himself with a pointed sniff, his eyes fixed on the girl's torn dress as if it were a personal affront to his piety. "Mr." Abernathy gave her a slow, appraising look that was far more insulting, a slick smile touching his lips before he heaved himself back into his seat. "Mrs." Gable herded her children past, pulling them close as if the girl's dishevelment were a contagion. The last empty space was on the bench next to Luke. She took a hesitant step inside, the floorboards groaning under her slight weight. She clutched her valise to her chest like a shield. Everyone was watching her now, their silence thick with judgment and suspicion. A decent woman didn't travel alone, and certainly not in such a state. She was running. That much was clear. Running from what or whom was the question that hung in the air. She stood there, swaying with a tremor that was not from the coach, her eyes locked on the space beside the silent cowboy. He was an intimidating figure, his sheer size filling the corner. A holstered pistol was visible at his hip, the leather dark and well-oiled. He represented a different kind of danger from the leering salesman or the condemning preacher, a wilder and more unpredictable sort. Yet, in his stillness, there was none of their cloying judgment. There was only a quiet, unnerving watchfulness. Gathering what looked to be the last of her courage, she took another step. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked with dust. "Pardon me, sir." Luke's expression didn't change. He just watched her, his gaze steady from beneath the brim of his hat. She swallowed, the effort visible in the slender column of her throat. Is this seat occupied?" The question was a formality. It was obviously the only one left. What she was really asking was something else entirely. "Will you let me sit here? Will you grant me this small space of refuge?" The silence stretched. The driver shouted from outside, preparing to leave. The air in the coach grew hotter, heavier. Luke's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, taking in the frayed hem of her sleeve, the white-knuckled grip she had on her valise, the faint trembling of her lower lip. He saw the story there, or at least the edges of it. He saw trouble. He saw a woman running hard, and he knew from long experience that whatever she was running from was probably not far behind. His entire life was a carefully constructed exercise in avoiding other people's trouble. He had his own path to walk, and it was a solitary one by design. Getting tangled up with a frightened girl in a torn dress was a complication he neither needed nor wanted. He could have said yes. He could have lied and said he was saving the seat, forcing her to stand or, more likely, to be put off the coach entirely. It would have been the sensible thing to do. It would have been the easy thing to do. But then he looked up again, back into her eyes, and in their depths, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, he saw a sliver of something else, a flicker of defiance, a desperate plea that asked for nothing more than a moment's peace. It was the look of a soul pushed to its absolute limit, with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. Her anxiety was a palpable thing, a raw and honest current in the stagnant air. It wasn't just the nervousness of a lone traveler. It was the gut-wrenching terror of the hunted. He thought of lonely roads, of cold nights, of the countless times a small kindness would have felt like a king's ransom. He thought of the hard lines the world drew around people, and the silent judgments that could condemn a person without a trial. The hesitation, which felt like an eternity to her, lasted only a few seconds for him. He gave no sign of his internal debate. His expression remained a stony mask. But then, slowly, He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't speak, he didn't smile or offer any word of welcome. He simply shifted his large frame a few inches closer to the coach wall, a silent concession that spoke volumes. The movement was small, but in the hostile confines of the carriage, it was a profound act. A shudder of relief went through the girl, so powerful it was visible. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction, with a murmured word of thanks that was lost in the jingle of the harness outside. She slid onto the bench. She pressed herself against the side of the coach, trying to make herself as small as possible, to take up no more space than was absolutely necessary. She placed her valise on her lap, her hands folded tightly over it. The driver's whip cracked like a gunshot. The coach lurched forward, throwing her against the hard wooden wall. She let out a small, involuntary gasp. The journey had resumed. The suffocating silence descended once more, but its character had changed. It was now charged with a new, unspoken dynamic. The girl, Clara, sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on her own hands, intensely aware of the man beside her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, sense the solid, unyielding presence of him just inches away. He was a wall of silence and shadow, and she didn't know if he was a wall she could hide behind, or one that was closing her in. Luke, for his part, had returned his gaze to the window, to the endless, sun-blasted landscape. He seemed, once again, to be a man apart, lost in his own thoughts. But he was aware of the slight, trembling woman beside him. He was aware of the scent of trail dust and fear, and the faint, incongruous smell of lavender that clung to her worn dress. He had invited trouble to sit next to him, and now he would have to ride with it. The red dust churned on, and the long, hot miles stretched out before them, silent and uncertain. The miles unspooled in a haze of red dust and unrelenting heat. Time inside the coach seemed to stretch and thin, measured not in minutes, but in the rhythmic creak of the axles and the jarring thud of the wheels dropping into unseen ruts. Clara remained pressed against the carriage wall, a study in forced stillness. She held her body so rigid it ached, her every muscle coiled tight, ready to spring. Though she faced forward, her awareness was entirely fixed on the man beside her. He was a mountain of quiet, a bulwark against the prying eyes of the other passengers, who continued to cast furtive, disapproving glances her way. She was acutely conscious of the small space of air that separated her arm from his. She could feel the steady warmth of him, a dry, solid heat that was different from the oppressive bake of the sun. It was the heat of a living, breathing being, and in her frayed state, it felt like the only anchor in a dizzying world. He, in turn, seemed completely oblivious to her presence. His gaze never wavered from the passing landscape. His posture relaxed and unchanged. He was a man at peace with silence, or perhaps one who simply found nothing in his current company worth the effort of speech. For Clara, the silence was a different entity altogether. It was not peaceful. It was a canvas onto which her fears painted vivid and terrible scenes. Every distant sound, every shift in the wind, made her flinch. She was a fugitive, and the open exposed terrain felt like a massive stage where she was the sole, terrified actor, with unseen eyes watching from every direction. The brief respite of finding a seat on the coach had evaporated, replaced by the gnawing certainty that it was only a matter of time. Then came the sound. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration. A tremor felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a distant pulse, subtly different from the chaotic clatter of the coach. Mr. Abernathy, the salesman, was the first to comment, his voice a petulant whine. "What in tarnation is that? Sounds like a herd of bison." Reverend Miller peered out his window, his brow furrowed. The Lord's army on the march to smite the wicked? Perhaps. Luke's posture didn't change. But Clara, watching his reflection in the dusty glass, saw his eyes narrow slightly. He had heard it long before the others, his senses attuned to the language of the wilderness. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch, listening. The drumming grew louder, resolving itself into the distinct, rapid beat of galloping horses. Not the lumbering gait of a herd, but the focused, purposeful rhythm of riders pushing their mounts hard. A knot of ice formed in Clara's stomach. She knew that sound. She had been hearing it in her nightmares for weeks. Her breath hitched. Her hands, already clenched on her valise, tightened until her knuckles were stark white. She instinctively shrank further into her corner, her shoulder brushing against the sleeve of Luke's duster. The fabric was coarse, smelling faintly of wood smoke, leather, and the clean scent of the open plains. 3 riders appeared over a low rise, silhouetted for a moment against the blinding sky. They were not traveling the road, but cutting across the open scrub, their path set to intercept the coach. They rode with a grim, predatory efficiency, their bodies low over their horses' necks. Even at this distance, their intent was unmistakable. They were not travelers. They were hunters. "Mrs." Gable gave a small, frightened cry and pulled her children closer. The salesman paled, his bluster evaporating. This was the frontier, and riders approaching a coach with such speed rarely brought good tidings. But Clara wasn't worried about robbery. Her fear was older, deeper, and far more personal. As the riders drew closer, she could make out their faces. A lanky, hard-bitten man with a drooping mustache she knew as Jeb, a younger, wiry boy named Silas, who rode with a reckless cruelty, and leading them, a heavy-set man on a powerful bay horse. His name was Abel, but she had been forced to call him husband. His face was a thundercloud of righteous fury, his eyes scanning the coach with an unnerving intensity. They had found her. A wave of pure, unreasoning panic washed over her. The carriage, which had seemed a fragile shelter, was now a trap. The walls were closing in, the air growing thick and unbreathable. Her vision tunneled until all she could see were the 3 figures closing in, symbols of the life she had risked everything to escape. Her first instinct was to bolt, to throw open the door and run into the merciless sun. But her limbs were frozen, locked in place by terror. Abel spurred his horse closer, drawing level with her window. His eyes, small and cold, raked across the passengers. For a horrifying second, their gazes met. She saw the flash of recognition, the triumphant, possessive sneer that twisted his lips. He knew she was here. It was over. Her mind screamed, without thinking, without conscious thought. She acted on pure survival instinct. She turned away from the window, pressing herself into the corner of the seat, her body flush against Luke's. The movement was sudden, desperate. She buried her face against the rough fabric of his duster, trying to make herself disappear, to merge with his shadow. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a thread of sound so faint it was barely more than a breath against his sleeve. "Please." He remained perfectly still, his body an unyielding wall of muscle and bone. He gave no indication that he had heard her. "Please," she breathed again, the word torn from the very depths of her soul. "Don't let them see me. Don't let them take me." This was it, the ultimate gamble. She knew nothing of this silent, watchful man. He could be worse than the men outside. He could shove her away, call her out, hand her over for a coin or simply to avoid trouble. She had placed the tattered remnants of her hope in the hands of a complete stranger, basing her entire fate on a single, quiet nod he had given her miles ago. For a long moment, Luke did nothing. He continued to stare out the window, his expression as unreadable as a weathered stone. From the corner of his eye, he could see the rider, Abel, peering into the coach, his gaze sweeping over the occupants. He saw the man's eyes pass over the preacher, the salesman, the mother and her children. He saw them linger on his own corner of the coach. Clara held her breath, convinced her heart had stopped beating. She was utterly vulnerable, her face hidden against this man's side, her entire being surrendered to his mercy, or lack thereof. Then he moved. It was not a large movement, It was so subtle, so seemingly casual, that anyone not pressed against him would have missed it entirely. He shifted his weight slightly, a simple adjustment of his position on the hard bench. As he did, he drew the left side of his long duster forward, the heavy fabric falling in a drape that covered her almost completely from the window's view. It shielded her bowed head and trembling shoulders, effectively erasing her from the scene. To the man outside, it would look as though a tall cowboy was simply making himself more comfortable, his coat bunched beside him. It was an act of concealment, a silent conspiracy. The warmth of his body seeped through her thin dress, a steady, grounding presence in the chaos of her fear. A single, wild sob of relief caught in her throat, and she choked it back, pressing her lips tightly together. He had heard her. He had answered. Abel's frustrated gaze continued to scan the coach's interior. He couldn't have missed her getting on at Dry Gulch. He must have been questioning his own eyes. His glare settled on Luke. It was a hostile, challenging look, the kind of stare that measures a man and invites a confrontation. Luke met the stare through the glass. His face remained impassive, his eyes shadowed and calm. He did not look away. He did not issue a challenge of his own. He simply looked back, his presence a quiet, undeniable fact. I am here. This is my space. There was no fear in him, and no aggression. There was only a profound and unshakable stillness. And then he made his second move. His right hand, which had been resting on his thigh, dropped slowly, casually, to his side. The movement was fluid, unhurried. His fingers brushed against the worn leather of his gun belt, coming to rest with the tips of his fingers just touching the smooth, checkered grip of the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a draw. It was a statement, a quiet, deadly punctuation mark at the end of an unspoken sentence. Outside, Abel held Luke's gaze for a second longer. Perhaps he saw the hand. Perhaps he only saw the utter lack of fear in the man's eyes. Whatever he saw, it gave him pause. Starting a fight with a stranger of Luke's description, inside a coach full of witnesses, was a risky proposition. Convinced that the girl must have somehow slipped away, or that he was mistaken, he let out a guttural curse, reined his horse sharply, and galloped ahead to shout at the driver. The immediate danger had passed. The riders moved to the front of the coach, their voices angry and indistinct. Clara remained frozen, huddled against Luke, for a full minute longer. She could hear the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. Slowly, shakily, she released the breath she had been holding in a long, shuddering sigh. The trembling that had seized her body began to subside, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Luke still had not moved. His hand remained near his gun, his duster still shielding her. He was a statue of gray cloth and quiet resolve. He continued to look out the window as if nothing of any consequence had just occurred. But his body, firm and warm against hers, was a testament to the contrary. He had become her shield. He had stood between her and the life she was running from without a single word, using only his presence, his stillness, and the silent promise of violence. Slowly, Clara lifted her head. She didn't move away. Not yet. She just leaned back against the seat, her shoulder still touching his. The heat no longer felt oppressive. It felt safe. The silence no longer felt menacing. It felt like a shared secret. Her voice, when she finally found it again, was barely audible over the rumbling of the wheels. Do you often help strangers?" Luke's gaze remained on the red, empty horizon. A long moment passed. When he finally answered, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the first words she had ever heard him speak. Only the ones who looked like they need it. The angry voices outside the coach were a raw, brutal sound that sliced through the thin veneer of civility within. The driver, his tone a mix of fear and capitulation, was arguing ineffectually. Then came the heavy thud of boots on the carriage step and the violent wrench of the door being thrown open. Abel stood framed in the doorway, his large body blocking the dying light of the afternoon sun. His face was slick with sweat and twisted into a mask of pure, possessive rage. "There you are," he snarled, his eyes locking onto Clara. The words were not a greeting. They were a verdict. He ignored the other passengers. His entire being focused on her with a singular, terrifying intensity. "Thought you could run, did you? Thought you could just steal what's mine and disappear?" Panic, cold and absolute, seized Clara. Her throat closed, and a strangled sound was all that escaped her. The world compressed into the terrifying figure in the doorway. The suffocating confines of the coach, and the looming certainty of her capture. It was over. She had failed. Next to her, Luke had not appeared to move, yet the entire quality of his presence had changed. His relaxed stillness had vanished, replaced by a coiled tension, the lethal calm of a predator about to strike. His eyes, fixed on Abel, were as hard and flat as river stones. Abel took a step into the carriage, reaching for her. "Get out here now. We're going home." And in that instant, everything happened at once. Before Abel's hand could even come close, Luke moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. He didn't rise to fight. He didn't draw his weapon. He did something far more unexpected. His hand shot out, not to Clara, but to the thin curtain on the window of the opposite door. With one powerful tug, he ripped it from its rod. In the same fluid motion, he turned to Clara, his voice a low, urgent command that cut through her terror. "Now." He didn't wait for her to understand. His arm snaked around her waist, lifting her from the seat as if she weighed nothing. He was not gentle, but there was no cruelty in the motion. It was the rough, efficient grip of pure necessity. As Abel lunged forward with a roar of outrage, Luke spun them both around. Using his body as a shield, he kicked the opposite door, his heavy boot striking the flimsy latch with a sharp crack of splintering wood. The door flew open, revealing the steep, sandy embankment the coach had stopped beside. "Jump," he commanded, his voice in her ear. There was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. There was only his voice and the solid wall of his body propelling her forward. She caught a fleeting glimpse of the horrified faces of the other passengers, of Abel's face contorted in disbelief and fury. Then they were through the door and falling. The world became a chaotic blur of sky and red earth. Luke held her tight against him, twisting in midair so that he would take the brunt of the landing. They hit the embankment not with a thud, but with a sliding, scraping impact that stole the breath from her lungs. The ground was a steep cascade of loose sand and sharp scree. They didn't stop where they landed. They rolled, tumbling over and over in a disorienting, violent descent. Clara's head swam. The world was a dizzying spin of bruised limbs and burning scrapes. She felt the sharp sting of rocks tearing at her dress and skin. Sand filled her mouth, her nose, her eyes. Through it all, Luke's arm was a steel band around her, his body absorbing the worst of the impacts, his grunts of pain lost in the skittering slide of rock and dust. They came to a stop at the bottom of the gully in a tangled heap of limbs. For a moment, there was only a ringing in her ears and the searing pain in her scraped palms. Above them, angry shouts erupted. "They're gone." Down the bank, get after them. Clara's head was spinning, her body a single, throbbing ache. She coughed, spitting out a mouthful of gritty sand. Before she could even process what had happened, Luke was moving. He untangled himself from her and was on his feet in an instant, pulling her up with him. "Get up," he said, his voice harsh, ragged. "We have to move, now." She stumbled, her legs feeling like jelly. "I can't." "You can." His grip on her arm was mercilessly tight, yanking her forward. "Run, and don't you dare look back." He dragged her along the bottom of the gully, the high walls providing temporary cover. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world was plunging into the swift, deep twilight of the desert. Long, distorted shadows stretched from every rock and scrubby bush, turning the landscape into a confusing, monochromatic maze. The sound of hoofbeats echoed from the ridge above them, the riders trying to track their progress. They were exposed, their path dictated by the winding of the dry wash. Luke seemed to run on pure instinct, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead, always choosing the path with the deepest shadows, the most cover. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, and Clara had to half run, half stumble to keep up, her lungs burning, a sharp stitch in her side. She knew nothing about this man. He was a name without a past, a face without a story. An hour ago, he was a silent stranger in a coach. Now, he was her entire world, the only thing standing between her and the monstrous rage of Abel. She ran, fueled by a terror so profound it eclipsed her pain and exhaustion. She ran until her vision blurred and the world was nothing but the heaving of her own chest and the unyielding grip of the man pulling her into the growing darkness. Night fell completely, not with the gentle grace of the east, but like a heavy black cloth thrown over the sky. A sliver of moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light that made the landscape even more treacherous. The air grew cold with a sudden, biting chill. The sounds of their pursuit had faded, but neither of them believed they were safe. Luke finally slowed, pulling Clara into the deep shadow of a massive rock outcropping. She collapsed against the cold stone, her body trembling uncontrollably, sucking in desperate, ragged gasps of air. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her dress was in tatters, her arms and legs a lattice of painful scrapes. "Just for a minute," she panted, her voice cracking. "I can't go on." Luke didn't answer. He stood a few feet away, his back to her, listening to the night. His breathing was heavy but controlled. The stillness had returned to him, but it was a different kind of stillness now. It was the alert, predatory stillness of an animal in its own element. The darkness did not seem to hinder him. It seemed to be an ally. He was a man made of shadows and silence. And then they heard it. The faint, distant clatter of a horse's shoe striking rock. It was followed by another. The sound was closer than before. The men were not on the ridge anymore. They were down in the warren of canyons, searching, casting about in the dark. Clara's blood ran cold. A fresh wave of fear, sharp and metallic, washed over her, undoing the small recovery she had made. They were trapped. There was nowhere left to run. Luke turned, his face an unreadable mask in the moonlight. He looked down at her, huddled and trembling at the base of the rock. He could leave her. He could slip away into the darkness and save himself. It would be the smart thing to do. She was a liability, a magnet for the trouble he had so clearly tried to avoid. She closed her eyes, bracing for the sound of his footsteps walking away, leaving her to her fate. Instead, she heard a soft metallic click. Her eyes snapped open. Luke had drawn his Colt. The moonlight glinted off the long, dark barrel. He hadn't moved to leave. He had moved to fight. As the sound of the horses grew marginally closer, he stepped back, placing himself directly in front of her. He pushed her gently but firmly, urging her deeper into the crevice behind the rock. "Stay down. Don't make a sound." He crouched low, his broad shoulders a formidable silhouette against the starry sky, his body a living shield between her and the approaching danger. He held the pistol with a steady, practiced ease, its muzzle pointed into the darkness from which the sounds were coming. He was a bulwark, a fortress of one. Clara stared at his back, at the tense line of his shoulders, the absolute focus in his posture. The night was vast and cold, filled with men who wanted to hurt her, but in that small pocket of darkness, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a fragile, tentative sense of safety. She didn't know his story. She didn't know why he had helped her. A decision that had thrown him from his solitary path into a desperate, life-threatening flight. But as she watched him stand guard, his weapon at the ready, his entire being dedicated to protecting her, a single, Undeniable truth settled in her heart. He was not going to leave her. He was not going to let them take her. In the heart of the desolate, unforgiving wilderness, this silent, dangerous stranger would not abandon her. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. The hoofbeats faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the night. For a long time, neither of them moved. Luke remained a crouched silhouette, a guardian carved from the darkness, his pistol steady in his hand. Clara stayed huddled behind the rock, listening until the ringing in her own ears was the loudest sound she could hear. The immediate threat was gone, but the fear lingered, a cold residue deep in her bones. The wilderness was no longer a place of pursuit, but one of profound and intimidating emptiness. Finally, with a slow, deliberate motion, Luke lowered the hammer on his Colt and rose to his full height. He holstered the weapon without a word and turned to her. In the faint moonlight, his face was all sharp angles and deep shadows. "They're gone for now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But they'll pick up our trail at sunrise. We keep moving." The thought of walking another step sent a wave of despair through Clara. Her body was a symphony of aches, her feet raw and blistered within her ruined shoes. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice thin and reedy. "Somewhere they won't find us," he answered, offering no further explanation. He reached down, his large hand closing around her arm, and pulled her to her feet. She swayed, and his grip tightened for a moment to steady her before he released it. He expected her to walk on her own. And so they walked. The rest of the night was a waking nightmare, a blur of stumbling through the darkness. The terrain began to change. The sandy, rock-strewn gullies gave way to a steeper, upward climb. The air grew thinner, cooler, and carried a new scent on the wind, the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. Luke moved with an unnerving certainty, navigating the treacherous, moon-dappled ground as if he could see in the dark. He never spoke, but he was always aware of her. When she stumbled, a hand would appear to steady her. When a steep incline of loose rock seemed impassable, he would go first, then reach back to haul her up. He was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, as tireless and resolute as the ancient landscape itself. Clara moved in his wake, her mind numb with exhaustion, her body operating on a primal will to survive that she never knew she possessed. She focused on the dark shape of his back, on the steady rhythm of his footsteps, making it the one fixed point in her spinning world. Just as the first hint of gray began to soften the eastern sky, they crested a high ridge. Luke stopped, and Clara, walking on pure momentum, nearly collided with him. He put a hand out to stop her, and she followed his gaze. Below them lay a valley. It was a place that shouldn't have existed in the heart of such a harsh and unforgiving land. It was a deep, protected basin, hidden from the world by a high wall of pine-clad ridges, a narrow, winding creek, glittering like a silver ribbon in the pre-dawn light, snaked through a meadow of tall, green grass. A light mist clung to the valley floor, softening the edges of the world and muffling all sound. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint, sweet scent of unseen wildflowers. After the endless, suffocating red dust, it was like stepping into a dream. Nestled near the center of the valley, tucked into a grove of towering ponderosa pines, was a small, solitary ranch. It consisted of a sturdy-looking cabin built of rough-hewn logs, a small barn, and a simple corral, its fences weathered to a soft silver gray. A thin curl of smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, a sign of a fire recently banked, a silent testament to the fact that this was home, his home. The sight of it, the impossible green, the quiet solitude, the promise of shelter was so overwhelming that Clara's knees buckled. All the strength that had carried her through the night vanished in an instant. She sank to the ground, the last of her energy draining away, and simply stared. Luke watched her for a moment, then looked back down at the valley. A subtle change came over him. The hard, vigilant lines of his face seemed to soften. The tension in his shoulders eased. He had brought her to his sanctuary. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "Almost there." He helped her up, and this time he kept a steadying hand on her back as they made their way down the final, gentle slope. The last leg of the journey was dreamlike. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles under her feet. The birds were beginning to sing their morning chorus. By the time they stumbled into the ranch yard, the sun was just beginning to crest the eastern ridge, flooding the small valley with a clean, golden light. The yard was Spartan but tidy. A well-worn axe was sunk into a large chopping block, surrounded by neatly stacked firewood. A leather saddle rested on a rail, awaiting repair. Everything spoke of a life of solitude and self-sufficiency. A single horse in the corral, a sturdy buckskin, lifted its head and gave a soft nicker of greeting. Luke led her not to the cabin, but to the stone-lined well in the center of the yard. He worked the crank, the chain rattling in the morning quiet, and drew up a bucket of water so clear and cold it seemed to sparkle. He filled a tin dipper and held it out to her. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if the urgency of the past 12 hours had been a fever that had finally broken. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if she was thirsty. He simply offered the water. Clara took the dipper with trembling hands. She drank, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It was clean and cold and pure, washing the dust from her throat and the lingering taste of fear from her mouth. She drank until she couldn't drink anymore, the cold water aching in her teeth. When she was done, she simply sat on the low stone wall of the well, the empty dipper in her lap, and let the morning sun warm her face. The trembling in her limbs finally began to subside. Luke gave the rest of the water to his horse, then disappeared into the barn. Clara stayed where she was, adrift in a sea of exhaustion and profound, disbelieving relief. There were no shouts, no hoofbeats, no angry men. There was only the sound of the wind sighing through the pines, the soft stamping of the horse, and the distant murmur of the creek. She was safe. The concept was so foreign, so overwhelming, that she couldn't fully grasp it. When Luke emerged from the cabin a few minutes later, he carried a clean cloth and a small jar. He stopped in front of her and held them out. "For the scrapes," he said, his gaze briefly flicking over her torn arms. He set them down beside her on the well, along with a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried jerky, before turning and walking back inside, leaving her to her privacy. The silence was a balm. His lack of questions was a gift greater than any words of comfort could have been. He didn't ask her name, where she came from, or what she was running from. He had seen all he needed to see, and for now, that was enough. He had given her water, food, and medicine, and then he had given her space. After she had cleaned her wounds as best she could with the cool well water and the soothing, herbal-scented salve, a strange sort of energy began to return to her. It wasn't the frantic, fear-fueled energy of the flight, but something quiet and purposeful. She couldn't just sit there. She couldn't be a useless burden. She stood up and looked around the yard. It was a man's space, functional and without adornment. A worn-out broom leaned against the cabin wall. She picked it up. The porch was covered in a layer of dust and fallen pine needles. Slowly, methodically, she began to sweep. The simple, repetitive motion was calming, grounding. It was a small act of order in a world that had been nothing but chaos. It was her only way of saying thank you. When she finished the porch, she saw that the wood box beside the door was nearly empty. She walked to the chopping block, gathered an armful of split logs, and carried them to the box. She made 3 trips, until it was full. Then she collected the kindling he had chopped and stacked it neatly beside the hearth she could see through the open cabin door. She moved quietly, as if she were a ghost, as if she had been performing these small chores in this exact place her entire life. Luke watched her from the doorway of the cabin, leaning against the frame with a cup of coffee in his hands. He said nothing. His face was unreadable, but his eyes followed her every move. He watched her bring order to his solitary world, a small, determined figure moving through the golden morning light. And he did not stop her. As dusk began to settle, tinting the sky in shades of violet and rose, a companionable quiet had formed between them. He had cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon over the fire, and they ate sitting on the porch steps, the silence broken only by the crackle of the flames and the chirping of crickets. The terror of the chase had receded, leaving behind a deep, resonant weariness and a fragile sense of peace. Clara looked out at the valley, at the dark, silent pines standing like sentinels on the ridges that enclosed them. It was a beautiful, lonely place, just like the man sitting beside her. She turned her head, looking at his profile in the flickering firelight. She saw the hard lines of his jaw, the deep-set eyes, the scars on his knuckles. He was a hard man, a dangerous man. He had proven that, but he had also been kind. His kindness wasn't in words, but in actions, in a shared dipper of water, in a jar of salve, in a silent invitation to his sanctuary. It was a language she was not used to, but one she was beginning to understand. Her voice, when she spoke, was as soft as the evening air. "You're not what I imagined a cowboy would be." He didn't turn to look at her, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. He took a slow sip of his coffee before answering, "Oh, and what did you imagine?" "I don't know," she admitted, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Rougher, I suppose. Louder. Men who take what they want and don't care who gets hurt." The image of Abel flashed in her mind, and she shivered. Men who are strong in a cruel way. Luke set his cup down and finally turned his head to look at her. The firelight played in his eyes, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of something beyond his stoic reserve, something knowing, and perhaps a little sad. A low, quiet laugh rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a sound of mockery, but of a deep, weary wisdom. "Wait and see," he said, his voice a soft murmur in the gathering dark. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as quiet and steady as the creek that flowed through the valley. A fragile, unspoken truce settled over the small ranch. Luke did not press her for her story, and Clara did not ask about his. They existed in a shared space of silence, communicating through actions rather than words. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and sure, and head out to mend fences or tend to his horse. She would wake to the smell of coffee and find he had left a portion for her on the hearth. In return, she brought a semblance of order to his solitary life. She found a stash of old flour and baked dense, serviceable bread. She swept the cabin until the floorboards were clean of their years of accumulated dust. She mended the tear in his shirt with a needle and thread she discovered in a small wooden box. Her stitches small and neat. They were the chores of a home, and performing them felt like an act of defiance against the chaos that had chased her here. Each swept floor, each folded blanket, was a small claim on a life she was determined to build from the ashes of her old one. They ate their meals on the porch, watching the sun move across the high ridges. The silence between them was no longer the tense, watchful quiet of the stagecoach. It was a comfortable, breathing thing, full of unasked questions but free of judgment. She learned the landscape of his face the way a small muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was deep in thought, the faint lines around his eyes that crinkled when he looked towards the sun. He, in turn, learned the cadence of her movements, the quiet efficiency with which she worked, the way she would sometimes pause and stare out at the valley, her expression distant and haunted. One evening, after a dinner of roasted rabbit he had hunted, they sat by the fire inside the small cabin. The nights were growing colder, and the flames cast dancing, distorted shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. Luke was cleaning his rifle, his large, calloused hands moving with an expert familiarity, breaking the weapon down and oiling each part with meticulous care. Clara sat on a low stool, watching the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup. The safety of the valley had been a balm, allowing the raw edges of her terror to finally begin to heal. But safety also brought with it the space for memory, and her past was a guest that had followed her here, sitting beside her in the firelight. Luke glanced up from his work, his eyes catching the flicker of fear and sorrow on her face. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of spooked horses and wounded animals. He stopped what he was doing, laying a piece of oiled cloth on the rough-hewn table. His voice was low, not prying, simply an observation. "You're a long way from home." The statement was simple, but it cracked the dam of her silence. Her story, which she had held inside like a shard of glass for so long, began to spill out, not in a torrent, but in a slow, painful trickle. "I don't have a home," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not one I would ever claim." She stared into the flames, as if the past were playing out in their fiery dance. "My father, he was a good man, I think, but a weak one. He had debts he couldn't pay. A man came to collect. His name was Abel." She spoke the name, and the air in the cabin seemed to grow colder. Luke remained perfectly still, his hands resting on the components of his rifle. He did not look at her, but she knew he was listening to every word. "He was older than my father, a widower with a large farm and a temper known throughout the county. He saw me. I was 16. He told my father that all debts would be forgiven if I would become his wife." She took a shaky breath, the memory still raw, still humiliating. It wasn't a proposal. It was a transaction. I was part of a bill of sale, a horse, a parcel of land, a daughter. My father cried when he told me. He said there was no other way. I was to be the price of his solvency. She fell silent, the crackle of the fire filling the space between her words. She remembered the cold, dead feeling in her chest, the sense of her life ending before it had even begun. She had been sold, not into a life of hardship, which she could have borne, but into a life of ownership. She had ceased to be a person and had become a piece of property. "They called him my husband," she continued, her voice laced with a bitterness that was sharp and clean. "But he was my owner. He never saw me as anything more than something he had bought and paid for. He demanded obedience, not affection. He wanted a servant for his house and a body for his bed, and he believed he had a right to both. Every day, he would remind me of the favor he had done my family, of the debt I owed him. My very existence was a debt." Luke's jaw was a hard, tight line. His gaze was fixed on the dark, empty window, but his focus was entirely on her, on the quiet, devastating pain in her voice. "For 2 years, I endured it. I learned to be quiet. I learned to make myself small, to anticipate his moods, to avoid the back of his hand. I learned to be invisible. But inside I was screaming. I would watch the birds fly free over the fields, and I would feel such a rage, such a desperate, burning need to be one of them." She looked down at her hands, turning them over. They were chapped and scraped now from work, but they were her own. He kept his money in a lockbox in his study. I knew where he hid the key. I had watched him for months. I told myself it wasn't stealing. How can you steal from a man who has stolen your entire life? You are merely taking back a piece of what was yours. Her voice grew stronger now, fueled by the memory of her own courage. One night, he drank himself into a stupor. I took the key. I took every last dollar from that box. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a ticket on a stagecoach heading west. It was enough to buy my freedom. I left my wedding ring on his pillow, and I ran all night through the woods to the next town, and I haven't stopped running since." She finally looked at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, her expression a mixture of shame and defiance. She had laid her entire sordid story at his feet. She expected revulsion, pity, or worse, the cold judgment she had seen in the eyes of the other passengers. She was a runaway wife, a thief, by the laws of God and man. She was a sinner. Luke did not look at her with judgment. He looked at her with a profound, unnerving stillness. His eyes held a deep, ancient understanding of the world's casual cruelty. He said nothing. He didn't offer empty words of comfort or tell her she had done the right thing. He didn't have to. His silence was its own form of absolution. It was a silence that did not condemn. He slowly picked up the pieces of his rifle and began to reassemble them with the same methodical care. When the weapon was whole again, he stood up and walked to a small, dusty chest in the corner of the cabin. He opened the lid and rummaged inside for a moment before pulling something out. He walked back and stood before her. He held out his hand. Lying on his broad, calloused palm was a knife. It was not a large weapon, but it was beautifully made. The handle was of smooth, dark wood, and the blade was a slender sliver of polished steel, honed to a razor's edge. It was a tool of precision and lethality. "You did what you had to do to survive," he said, his voice a low gravel. "But running is only half of it. You need to be able to stand and fight, too." He closed her hand around the smooth handle of the knife. Her fingers were small and trembled slightly against his. "Keep this with you, not in your bag, on you, in a pocket, tucked in your boot. Somewhere it is always close to your heart." He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Don't ever let a man lay hands on you again unless you want him to. Don't ever let them make you feel like property. Your life is your own. You fight for it." Clara stared down at the knife in her hand. It felt solid, real, and strangely comforting. It was not a gift of sentiment. It was a gift of power. He wasn't trying to protect her. He was giving her the means to protect herself. He was acknowledging her past and arming her for her future. It was the most profound act of respect she had ever known. A sad, weary smile touched her lips. She looked up at him, at this quiet, dangerous man who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she had known in 2 years. "I used to think all strong men were cruel," she said, her voice soft with a dawning revelation. "I thought strength was just a weapon to be used against people who had none." Luke's expression did not change, but a flicker of something ancient and knowing passed through his eyes. He had seen the world's cruelty, and he had met its false strength with his own quiet, unyielding kind. "Then you probably haven't met a truly strong one," he said. He turned and went back to his table, leaving her with the knife, the truth of his words, and the vast, silent darkness of the valley outside. The change came in the late afternoon. The sky, which for days had been a vast, cloudless expanse of brilliant blue, began to take on a bruised, yellowish tint along the western horizon. The wind, which had been a constant, gentle sigh through the pines, died completely. An unnatural stillness fell over the valley, heavy and expectant. The birds went silent. The air grew thick, humid, and difficult to draw into the lungs. Luke, who had been splitting wood with a steady, rhythmic swing of his axe, stopped mid-swing. He stood motionless for a long moment, his head tilted, his gaze fixed on the discolored sky. He seemed to be tasting the air, reading the signs that were invisible to Clara. He set the axe down, his movements losing their relaxed efficiency and taking on a new, focused urgency. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice flat and factual, "a bad one." He didn't need to elaborate. Clara could feel it in her own skin, a prickling sense of unease, an oppressive weight in the atmosphere. She followed his lead without question as he began to prepare. He strode to the corral, his long legs covering the ground quickly, and led his horse into the relative safety of the small, sturdy barn. He checked the latch on the barn door, testing it with his shoulder to ensure it would hold against a heavy wind. Clara, feeling a need to be useful, began gathering the tools he had left out, placing the saw and the whetstone back inside the barn just before he closed the heavy door. He secured it with a thick wooden bar. He then moved to the cabin, his eyes scanning the roof, the chimney, the heavy wooden shutters on the single glass window. He checked each one, making sure it was securely fastened. "Bring in the rest of that firewood," he instructed her, gesturing to the pile she had stacked by the door. All of it. They worked together in a swift, silent partnership. He brought in extra buckets of water from the well while she carried armload after armload of wood, stacking it high beside the stone hearth. The air grew darker, the light fading with an unnatural speed. A low, distant rumble, like a giant clearing his throat, vibrated through the soles of their feet. The first gust of wind hit the valley then, a violent, explosive force that tore through the pines with a sound like a great wave crashing on a distant shore. It rattled the cabin door in its frame and sent a spiral of dust and pine needles dancing across the yard. Luke pulled the heavy door shut, dropping a thick bar into place across it. The world outside was instantly muted, the roar of the wind reduced to a low, insistent moan. The cabin, which had felt rustic and open, was now a small, dim fortress against the coming fury. The only light came from the fire in the hearth, which Luke was already building up, adding larger logs that would burn slow and hot through a long night. The storm broke over them with the force of a physical blow. Rain came first, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the roof and walls. The sound was deafening, a constant, furious roar that consumed all other noise. Then came the thunder. It wasn't the distant rumble from before, but a series of sharp, violent cracks that sounded as if the sky itself were being ripped apart. The explosions were so close, so powerful, that the very logs of the cabin seemed to shudder with each impact. Flashes of lightning lit the interior in stark, blue-white strobes, followed by an immediate, deafening clap of thunder. Clara had tried to make herself useful, preparing a simple meal, but the escalating violence of the storm had slowly unraveled her. She sat on her low cot in the small, partitioned-off corner of the cabin that had become her room, her hands clenched in her lap. With every crack of thunder, her shoulders jumped. She told herself it was just a storm. It was weather. It could not hurt her here, inside the solid walls of the cabin. But the storm was more than just a storm. The relentless, violent noise was a key. Unlocking doors in her mind she had tried so hard to nail shut. The roar of the wind was the sound of Abel's voice, raised in a drunken rage. The violent, unpredictable crashing of the thunder was the memory of a door being kicked open, of a heavy hand striking the wall beside her head. The feeling of being trapped in the small, dark cabin, with the world outside a raging chaos, was the feeling of her life in that farmhouse. A prisoner in a cage of someone else's making. A particularly violent gust of wind tore at the cabin, and the heavy wooden shutter over the window was ripped from one of its leather hinges. It began to slam against the log wall with a series of percussive, explosive bangs. Bang, bang, bang! The sound was a fist hammering on the door of her memory. The sound of Abel, locked out of her room, pounding and pounding until the wood splintered. A tremor started in Clara's hands. It was a fine, uncontrollable shaking that she tried to still by clenching her fists. But it was no use. The tremor spread, moving up her arms and into her shoulders, until her whole body was vibrating with a deep, internal chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She pulled a thin blanket tighter around her, but the cold was inside her. It was the cold of absolute, helpless fear. Her breathing grew shallow, coming in small, ragged gasps. The log walls of the cabin seemed to be pressing in, the air growing thick and heavy, suffocating her. She closed her eyes, but the images were there, waiting for her in the darkness. Abel's face, contorted and red, the glint of the lamp on the whiskey bottle, the smell of stale liquor on his breath, the feeling of his hand closing around her arm, his fingers like a vice. She was no longer in Luke's cabin. She was back there, in that cold, silent house, waiting for the inevitable violence to find her. The shaking intensified, and a low, wounded sound escaped her lips, half whimper, half sob. Luke had been sitting by the fire, his back to her, a stoic, unmoving presence against the storm. He had been giving her space, letting her weather her own internal tempest. But he heard the sound. He had been listening for it. He turned his head slowly, his eyes accustomed to the dim light, finding her small, trembling form in the corner. He saw not a woman frightened by a thunderstorm, but a soul in the grip of a much older and more terrifying storm. He rose to his feet. His movement was silent, deliberate. He did not speak. He knew, with a deep, instinctual certainty, that words would be useless. They would be a clumsy intrusion into the private hell she was reliving. He walked to his own bedroll, a simple pallet on the other side of the cabin. From it, he took his second blanket, a thick, heavy wool that smelled of wood smoke. He walked to the partition of her small room and stopped in the opening. She flinched when his shadow fell over her, her eyes flying open, wide with a wild, cornered animal terror. For a terrifying second, the face she saw was not his, but Abel's. Luke stopped. He did not come any closer. He simply stood there, letting her eyes adjust, letting her mind separate the shadow in front of her from the shadows in her past. He held the blanket in his hands. He did not speak. He just waited. Slowly, the frantic terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning recognition. It was Luke. It was the man from the valley, the man with the quiet hands and the watchful eyes. He took a single, slow step into the small space. He reached out and, without touching her, he gently tossed the heavy wool blanket over her. It settled over her trembling form, its weight a solid, comforting presence. It was not a gesture of intimacy. It was a gesture of profound, practical care. It was an acknowledgement of her suffering and a simple, direct attempt to soothe it. He then turned and walked away, not back to his own bed, but to the hearth. He took a low stool and placed it near the fire, positioning himself so that he was squarely between her and the main part of the cabin, between her and the door. He sat down, his back to her once more, and picked up a piece of wood, pulling a knife from his belt and beginning to whittle. He was standing guard. He was a silent, unmovable sentinel, his broad shoulders a fortress against the raging storm and the ghosts it had summoned. He did not sleep. He just sat, the rhythmic scrape of his knife on the wood a small, steady sound in the heart of the chaos. The firelight glinted off the blade of his knife, casting his stern, focused profile into sharp relief. Clara lay under the weight of the two blankets, the shaking in her body slowly, gradually, beginning to subside. The terrible cold began to recede, beaten back by the warmth of the wool and the even greater warmth of his silent, protective presence. She watched his back, the steady, patient work of his hands. He was a wall, a shield. He had placed himself between her and the night, and he had done so without a single word. The storm raged for hours, but its fury began to feel more distant. The hammering of the shutter, the roar of the wind, the crash of the thunder, they were still there, but they could not get past the quiet man sitting by the fire. He absorbed it all, his stillness a defiant anchor in the maelstrom. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, the storm began to break. The wind died down to a low, mournful sigh. The rain softened to a steady drumming on the roof. The thunder moved off, rumbling in the distant mountains. A deep, exhausted quiet settled over the valley. Luke had stopped whittling. He sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees, still watching the fire. Clara thought he might have finally fallen asleep sitting up. The trembling had stopped completely now, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a raw, aching gratitude. Slowly, quietly, she stole her hand out from under the heavy blankets. The air was cold on her skin. She reached out into the dim space between her cot and his stool, her fingers, trembling now not with fear but with a hesitant, desperate need for connection, brushed against the back of his hand. He did not move. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. His hand was large, warm, and calloused. She let her fingers rest there for a long moment, a silent question in the quiet room. Then, slowly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, his hand turned, and his fingers closed gently around hers. His grip was not tight or possessive. It was solid. It was steady. It was an answer. They stayed like that, their hands linked in the firelight, as the last of the storm sighed itself to sleep and the first, pale light of a new day began to filter through the cracks in the cabin walls. She did not sleep, but for the first time in a long, long time, she rested. The wind was finally quiet, and she was not alone. The dawn that broke over the valley was pristine, as if the world had been scrubbed clean by the storm. A thick white mist rose from the damp earth, shrouding the bases of the pines and softening the hard edges of the landscape. The air smelled of rain-soaked soil and clean, sharp pine, a scent of pure renewal. The creek, swollen and brown, rushed through the meadow with a happy, gurgling roar. Clara awoke not to the sound of the storm, but to a profound and unfamiliar silence. She was still on her cot, the two heavy blankets cocooning her, her hand still loosely held in Luke's. Sometime during the last vestiges of the night, he had finally succumbed to exhaustion, slumping onto the stool, his head resting against the stone of the hearth, asleep but not gone. His grip on her hand had never faltered. She lay there for a long time, watching the soft morning light fill the small cabin, studying the sleeping face of the man who had been her guardian through the night, in sleep. The hard, watchful lines of his face were gone. The stern set of his jaw was relaxed. She saw not the intimidating stranger from the stagecoach or the lethal protector from the gully, but a man who looked profoundly weary, a man who carried his own invisible burdens. A faint, silvery scar cut through one of his eyebrows, a detail she had never noticed before. She wondered how many other scars he carried, both seen and unseen. Quietly, so as not to wake him, she slipped her hand from his. The loss of warmth was immediate. She rose from the cot and folded the blankets with a quiet reverence, placing the one he had given her back on his own bedroll. He had stood guard over her demons. The least she could do was let him rest. She moved about the cabin with the stealth of a mouse, rekindling the fire from the glowing embers and putting a pot of coffee on to brew. She stepped outside into the clean, cool morning. The storm had left its mark. A large branch had been torn from one of the pines, and smaller debris littered the yard. The single glass window of the cabin was askew, its heavy wooden shutter hanging from one remaining hinge, battered and splintered. When Luke finally stirred and came outside, the sun was well above the ridge, and the coffee was hot. He didn't mention the night before. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply took the cup she offered, his eyes scanning the yard, assessing the damage with a practical, unflustered gaze. The shared intimacy of the storm-tossed night hung between them, a powerful, unspoken thing. There was a new ease in their silence, a new depth. They had weathered something together, and it had changed the very air they breathed. "That shutter will need fixing," he said, his voice gravelly with sleep. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a quiet acknowledgement of what they had passed through. "And that window frame is loose." The wind found its weakness. "I can help," she said, the words coming out before she had even thought them. It felt natural. Right. This small, damaged piece of his sanctuary felt like a shared responsibility. They worked together for the rest of the morning. He brought out a box of tools, and with a series of simple, one-word instructions, he showed her what he needed. She held the heavy shutter steady while he worked to pry the broken leather hinge free. She sorted through a rusty tin of nails, finding the straightest ones for him. They moved in an easy, coordinated rhythm, their proximity no longer a source of tension but of quiet comfort. It was while they were working that she began to notice the small, ghost-like traces of another life, a life before hers. Tucked under the eaves of the porch, protected from the worst of the storm, was a small, hand-carved window box. It was empty now, save for damp soil and a few hardy weeds, but she could see that it had once been tended with care. No man like Luke, a man of such stark practicality, would have built a box for flowers. Inside the cabin, as she fetched a rag for him, she noticed it again. On the high mantelpiece, amongst a collection of spent cartridges and a whetstone, sat a small, intricately carved figure of a bluebird, its head cocked as if listening to a song. Its delicate form was so at odds with the Spartan masculinity of the rest of the cabin. It was a thing of beauty and patience, and it did not feel like his. These small details began to weave a story in her mind. A woman had lived here. A woman had planted flowers and had placed a small, beautiful thing on the mantel. She had shared this cabin, this valley, this man. Clara felt a strange, hollow ache in her chest. It was not jealousy, but a profound and sorrowful curiosity. Who was she? Was she beautiful? Did she laugh in this quiet valley? And the biggest question of all, the one that echoed in the silence of Clara's own wounded heart: why would anyone ever leave a place like this? The question brewed inside her all afternoon, a quiet counterpoint to the rhythmic sound of Luke's hammer as he worked to repair the splintered shutter. Finally, as he was fitting the mended shutter back against the window frame, she found the courage to ask. He was standing on a small crate, his arms raised as he struggled to align the heavy wood. She was on the ground, ready to hand him the pegs to secure it. Her voice was soft, hesitant, afraid of breaking the fragile piece they had built. Was there anyone else who lived here before me? Luke froze. His arms, straining with the weight of the shutter, went rigid. He did not look down at her. He stared straight ahead at the log wall of the cabin, but his gaze was 1,000 miles away. The easy rhythm of their work was shattered, and in its place, a heavy, somber silence fell. The wind whispered through the pines, sounding for all the world like a sad, lonely sigh. He stood that way for a long time, the muscles in his back and shoulders corded with a tension that had nothing to do with the weight of the wood he was holding. Clara regretted her question instantly. She had trespassed, stumbled into a place of private pain. She opened her mouth to apologize, to tell him to forget she had asked. But he spoke before she could. His voice was rough, scraped raw with an old, deep-seated grief. Once. The word hung in the air between them, small and heavy as a stone. He lowered the shutter back to the ground with a soft thud and stepped down from the crate. He walked a few paces away and stood with his back to her, looking out at the vast, indifferent green of the valley. She left, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 sorrows. He paused, and when he spoke again, the words were a confession, a judgment he had long ago passed on himself, because I didn't know how to keep her. He offered no more, no name, no story, no explanation, just the stark, brutal fact of his own perceived failure. The words were a brand on his soul, and in speaking them aloud, he had allowed her to see it. He had not known how to keep her. The phrase echoed in Clara's mind. She thought of Abel, who had known only how to cage her, to own her, and here was a man who lamented not his lack of possession, but his lack of knowledge, his inability to make someone stay. The air around them was thick with shared wounds. His loss and her flight were two sides of the same coin, two lonely souls marked by the pain of departure. A deep sigh escaped her lips, a breath she felt she had been holding for years. "I'm not good at loving," she whispered, the words a confession of her own. She was admitting her own brokenness, her own fear that she was incapable of the very thing he had lost. Love, in her experience, was a transaction, a trap, a source of pain. She didn't know how to do it. She was afraid she would only break it, or be broken by it. Luke turned slowly to face her. The hard mask was back on his face, but his eyes were filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. He looked at her, at this fragile, determined woman who had run so hard and fought so fiercely for her freedom. A woman who believed herself incapable of the one thing that might make that freedom worthwhile. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. His voice was low, but it held a new and surprising intensity. Then let's try being good at not leaving first. The words were a challenge, a promise, and a plea, all wrapped in one. He wasn't asking for love, for grand pronouncements or complicated emotions. He was asking for something simpler, something more fundamental. He was asking for presence, for steadfastness, for the quiet, daily courage of just staying put. He was speaking a language her wounded heart could understand. Not leaving, that was a task, a practical thing. It was a foundation upon which something else, something terrifying and beautiful and unknown, might one day be built. No one spoke after that. There was nothing more to say. The words settled between them, sinking deep into the quiet spaces of their souls. Luke turned back to the window. He lifted the heavy shutter back into place. "The hammer," he said, his voice returning to its normal, practical tone, though the echo of his proposition still hung in the air. Clara picked it up and passed it to him. As he took it, his calloused, scarred fingers brushed against hers. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but a jolt, as sharp and bright as lightning, passed between them. Neither of them pulled away. For a fraction of a second, their hands lingered, a silent, binding contract. He looked down from the window. She looked up from the ground. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, everything was said. She saw his pain, his regret, his quiet hope. He saw her fear, her exhaustion, and the flicker of a desperate, answering hope in her own soul. It was a promise made without a single word. "We will try." He took the hammer, his fingers finally releasing hers, and began to gently tap the wooden pegs into place, securing the mended shutter, mending the breach in the cabin wall, and beginning the slow, painstaking work of mending the breaches in them both. The piece they had built was a fragile, delicate thing, like a spider's web spun in the morning dew. For a week, it held. The valley was their sanctuary, a world unto itself, governed by the rising of the sun and the slow, westward crawl of shadows. They spoke little, but their shared silence was a language. They learned each other's rhythms, the way a garden learns the patterns of the rain. The ghost of the woman who came before still lingered in the empty flower box and the carved bluebird on the mantel. But she was a sad, distant memory, not a rival. The promise they had made without words to be good at not leaving was a foundation they were building upon. One shared meal, one mended shutter at a time. The end of that piece came on a bright, cloudless afternoon. It was announced not by a sound, but by the buckskin horse in the corral. The horse, which had been dozing in the sun, suddenly threw its head up, its ears swiveling, its nostrils flared. It let out a low, nervous whicker and sidestepped, its eyes fixed on the high, pine-choked ridge to the north. Luke was on the porch, oiling a piece of leather harness. He stopped instantly, his hands going still. He followed the horse's gaze. For a long moment, there was nothing but the green trees and the blue sky. Clara, who had been washing their tin plates in a basin of water, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had learned to trust his stillness. It was a more reliable barometer of danger than any shout or alarm. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement, a brief, unnatural glint of sunlight high up on the ridge, where no rock should have been so reflective, the glint of a rifle barrel. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, calm command that was more terrifying than any yell. "Go inside. Bar the door. Stay away from the window." He didn't have to say who it was. She knew. The fragile web had been torn. The outside world, with all its ugliness and violence, had found their sanctuary. She didn't argue. She dropped the plates into the basin with a clatter, dried her hands on her apron, and scrambled inside the cabin. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. Its solid thump, a pathetically inadequate sound against the threat she felt. She remembered his words, "Your life is your own. You fight for it." The small, sharp knife he had given her was tucked into the waistband of her skirt, its wooden handle a cold, solid pressure against her skin. Luke did not reach for the Colt at his hip. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose. Stepping inside the cabin just long enough to retrieve the shotgun he kept mounted over the hearth. He broke it open, his movements economical and sure, and slid 2 heavy brass shells into the twin barrels. The double click as he snapped it shut was a sound of absolute finality. He stepped back out onto the porch and stood there, directly in front of the door, the shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm, its long, dark barrels pointing towards the ground. He was not hiding. He was waiting, a mountain of a man, making his stand on his own land. They did not ride into the yard. They emerged from the trees on foot, materializing from the shadows like the malevolent spirits they were. Abel was in the lead, his heavy face flushed with a triumphant, ugly sneer. To his right was Jeb, the lanky man with the drooping mustache, a rifle held at the ready. On his left was the younger one, Silas, his hand hovering nervously over the pistol at his hip. They had left their horses on the ridge. Choosing a stealthy approach, they spread out, forming a loose semicircle, their eyes fixed on the lone figure on the porch. "Well, well," Abel's voice boomed across the yard, thick with false bonhomie. "Look what we have here, a cozy little love nest." He took a few steps closer, his eyes raking over the cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, the mended shutter. His gaze was a violation, an act of defilement on the peace they had built. Luke said nothing. He just stood there, the shotgun a casual weight in his arm, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. "I'll admit," Abel continued, stopping about 30 feet away, "you were harder to track than I gave you credit for, but a man always finds what belongs to him." His eyes flickered towards the cabin door. "I've come for my wife. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No need for any trouble between us." "She's not your wife," Luke said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard with the clear, hard resonance of a bell. "And this is my land. You're trespassing." A flash of anger crossed Abel's face. "That's my property she stole, and she is my property, bought and paid for. Now, I'm not asking you again." Inside, Clara pressed her back against the door, her whole body trembling. She could hear every word. "My property." The words were a cage, slamming shut around her. But then she felt the hard outline of the knife against her hip. A different voice echoed in her mind, Luke's voice. "Don't ever let them make you feel like property." A fire, hot and clean, began to burn through her fear. This was her life. This was her home, the only one she had ever chosen, and they would not take it from her. She looked around the dim cabin. Her eyes fell on the oil lamp sitting on the small table, its glass chimney clean, its reservoir full. An idea, wild and desperate, bloomed in her mind. She was not going to run. She was not going to hide. Outside, the standoff was reaching its breaking point. Abel's patience had run out. "Fine," he spat. "Have it your way." He nodded to his men. "Jeb, put a round through his leg. We'll drag her out over his body." Jeb started to raise his rifle. But in that split second, as Luke's body tensed and the shotgun began its smooth, deadly ascent, the cabin door was thrown open. Clara stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. In her hands, she held the oil lamp. It was lit. "Get away from him," she screamed, her voice not the thin, frightened whisper of a victim, but the raw, powerful cry of a defender. The 3 men stared, momentarily stunned by her sudden, defiant appearance. It was the only hesitation she needed. With a desperate prayer and all the strength she possessed, she swung her arm and hurled the lamp. It flew through the air in a fiery arc, aimed not at Abel, but at the wiry figure of Silas. The lamp shattered against his chest. A splash of burning oil and broken glass erupted, and in an instant, his shirt and vest were engulfed in flames. He shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure agony, dropping his pistol and frantically beating at his chest. The world exploded into chaos as Jeb and Abel turned, distracted by the screaming, burning man. Luke's shotgun roared. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening blast that echoed off the ridges of the valley. It wasn't aimed at Abel, it was aimed at Jeb. The buckshot tore through the air, and Jeb cried out, his rifle clattering to the ground as he staggered back, clutching a bloody, mangled hand. Abel, seeing his two men instantly incapacitated, let out a bellow of pure rage. This was no longer about retrieving his wife. It was a primal battle of wills. He ignored the shotgun, ignored Clara, and charged directly at Luke, his massive body a human battering ram. He hit Luke with the force of a runaway bull. The two men crashed back against the cabin wall, the impact shaking the very logs. Luke's shotgun flew from his grasp, skittering across the porch. Abel was a whirlwind of brute force, his fists like hammers, raining blows down on Luke's head and body. Luke was a powerful man, hardened by a life of labor and fighting, but Abel was driven by a single-minded, obsessive fury. Luke weathered the initial onslaught, his arms up to block the worst of the blows, grunting with pain as a fist connected with his ribs. He fought back, his own punches hard and precise, but it was a brawl, brutal and without finesse. Clara watched in horror as the two men grappled on the porch, a chaotic dance of violence. Jeb was on the ground, moaning and clutching his ruined hand. Silas had managed to tear off his burning vest and was rolling in the dirt, trying to smother the remaining flames on his shirt. Then she saw it. As Abel pushed Luke back, his hand fumbled at his belt, and he drew a long, heavy skinning knife, a glint of sunlight on the blade. He lunged, and Luke twisted away, but not fast enough. The knife sliced across Luke's left shoulder, and a dark, crimson line instantly appeared on his gray shirt, blossoming into a spreading stain. Luke cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain, and staggered back a step. His left arm went limp at his side. Seeing him wounded, seeing his blood, broke the last remnants of Clara's fear. A white-hot, protective rage surged through her, eclipsing everything else. She pulled the knife from her waistband, its handle fitting into her hand as if it were made for her. Abel raised his own knife for another, more final blow. "No!" Clara screamed. She launched herself from the doorway, a small, avenging fury. She didn't know how to fight with a knife, but that didn't matter. She held it in front of her, a sharp, glittering extension of her will. She ran straight at Abel's back. "Don't you touch him." Her scream, full of a ferocity he had never imagined she possessed, made Abel hesitate and turn. He saw her coming, this woman he had thought of as a timid, broken thing, now a wildcat with blazing eyes and a blade in her hand. His surprise cost him. As he turned, Luke, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, lunged forward. He drove his own right shoulder hard into Abel's chest, sending the bigger man stumbling back. At the same time, Clara reached him. She didn't stab, she slashed, a wild, horizontal cut, driven by pure instinct. The tip of her blade caught Abel across the forearm, slicing through his sleeve and leaving a long, shallow but deeply painful gash. Abel roared, a sound of both pain and utter disbelief. He looked down at his bleeding arm, then at Clara, his eyes wide with shock. This was impossible. The world had turned upside down. The sheep had turned on the wolf. The fight was broken. Jeb was out of commission, his gun hand shattered. Silas was a sobbing, scorched mess on the ground, and Abel himself was bleeding, facing not one opponent, but two. He had come to reclaim his property, expecting a simple retrieval. He had found a war. He had found a home he could not breach. He looked from Luke's grim, bleeding face to Clara's fierce, unyielding one. He saw no fear in her. None. He saw only a promise of more pain if he came any closer. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a sullen, bitter understanding that he had not just lost a fight. He had lost her, completely and irrevocably, with a final curse that was choked with impotent rage. He turned. He grabbed the whimpering Jeb by the collar and began to drag him back towards the trees, leaving Silas to stumble after them. Luke and Clara stood on the porch, watching them go. He was leaning heavily against a post, his face pale, his left side soaked in blood. She stood beside him, still clutching the knife, her knuckles white, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. They watched until the figures of their tormentors disappeared back into the shadows of the pines. They were alone again. The yard was a wreck of kicked-up dust, scattered tools, and the black, greasy smear where the lamp had burned. But they were standing, wounded, bleeding, and exhausted. But they were standing. Together. No one had fallen. They had protected each other. They had held their ground. The moment the retreating figures of their attackers were swallowed by the pines, the fragile, adrenaline-fueled strength that had held them upright seemed to vanish. Luke's body, which had been a rigid wall of defiance, sagged heavily against the porch post. The color drained from his face, leaving it a stark, ashen gray in the afternoon light. A low grunt of pain escaped his lips as he tried to shift his weight, and his eyes, which had been so full of cold fire, were now clouded with a deep, encroaching weariness. The sight of his sudden vulnerability broke through Clara's own shock. The knife, which she had been clutching in a white-knuckled grip, suddenly felt alien and heavy. She let it clatter to the wooden planks of the porch. The terror of the fight was gone, replaced by a new and even more terrifying fear, the fear of losing him. "Luke," she breathed, rushing to his side. She put a hand on his good arm, feeling the tremor of exhaustion and pain that ran through his powerful frame. "We have to get you inside." "I'm fine," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. The words were a blatant lie, an automatic defense from a man unaccustomed to showing weakness. He tried to push himself away from the post, but his wounded left arm was useless, and a fresh wave of dizziness made him stumble. He would have fallen if she hadn't been there. She threw her own small body against his, her shoulder braced under his good arm, her hand gripping his belt. She was impossibly small next to him, but she was a firm and unyielding support. "You are not fine," she said, her voice shaking but full of a new, unwavering authority. "Let me help you." For a moment, his pride warred with his pain. He looked down at her determined, upturned face, and the fight went out of him. He gave a slow, defeated nod and allowed his weight to settle against her. The journey of 10 feet from the porch into the cabin was an agonizing eternity. He was a dead weight, each step a jarring agony that sent a fresh wave of blood pulsing from the wound in his shoulder. She strained under his bulk, her muscles screaming, her feet shuffling to keep their balance. They stumbled through the doorway and across the small main room to a long, low couch that was built into the wall, its surface covered with a thick buffalo hide. He collapsed onto it with a shuddering groan, his head falling back against the log wall, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain. Clara stood over him, panting, her heart hammering. Now that he was down, the true extent of his injury was horribly clear. The gash was long and deep, a vicious, gaping line across the top of his shoulder and chest. The front of his shirt was a sodden, dark red ruin. He was losing too much blood. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her. She didn't know what to do. She was no doctor. But then she looked at his pale, pain-drawn face, and a fierce, protective instinct rose up to quell the fear. He had fought for her. He had bled for her. She would not let him die. Her mind, which had been a whirlwind of chaos, suddenly became sharp and clear. She moved with a purpose she didn't know she possessed. First, the bleeding. She grabbed a clean rag and pressed it hard against the wound, just as she had once seen her father do when a farmhand had been gored by a bull. Luke let out a sharp hiss of pain through his teeth, but didn't move. "I need to clean it," she said, her voice steady. "And stitch it. Do you have a needle? Strong thread whiskey." His eyes opened, and he looked at her with a kind of dazed surprise. He gave a weak nod toward the small chest in the corner. "Everything's in there." The next hour was a trial by fire. She found a bottle of whiskey, a surgeon's needle, and a spool of waxed linen thread in the chest, along with clean strips of linen for bandages. She stoked the fire until it was roaring hot and put a kettle of water on to boil. She worked with a focused intensity, her movements sure and deliberate. She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a fresh rag, her hands trembling only slightly. "This will hurt," she warned him, her voice soft. "Just do it," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The whiskey on the open wound made his entire body arch in a silent scream of agony. He didn't make a sound, but she saw the sweat bead on his forehead and the cords in his neck stand out like ropes. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle for the brutal work she was doing. Then came the stitches. Her first few were clumsy, jagged things, but she soon found a rhythm. She worked by the light of the fire and the setting sun, her needle dipping and rising, pulling the torn flesh together in a crude but functional seam. Through it all, he lay utterly still, his breathing harsh and ragged, a silent testament to the iron control he had over his own body. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly with the clean linen strips. She wiped the sweat and grime from his face with a cool, damp cloth. His skin was hot to the touch. A fever was setting in. Night fell. A deep, profound quiet descended on the valley, a stark contrast to the violence of the afternoon. Clara pulled a stool next to the couch and began her vigil. She did not sleep. She watched him, listened to the sound of his breathing, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. She kept the fire fed, and every hour she would dip a cloth in cool water and lay it across his forehead. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, his fever seemed to rise. He began to mutter, his head tossing back and forth on the buffalo hide. The words were indistinct, fragments of memory from a life she knew nothing about, names she didn't recognize, places she had never been. He was lost in the labyrinth of his own past, and she was the only one there to stand guard at its entrance. She leaned closer, her hand hovering over his shoulder, unsure of what to do. He was so large, so powerful, yet in that moment, he seemed terribly vulnerable. The stoic, unbreachable wall he presented to the world had crumbled, revealing the wounded man within. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, the weary sadness in the curve of his brow. She saw the man, not the cowboy, the man who had stood between her and a life of misery, the man who had weathered a storm, both inside and out, simply to keep her safe, the man who had asked only that she be good at not leaving. A wave of feeling so powerful, so overwhelming, washed through her that it left her breathless. It was a complex and beautiful tapestry of gratitude, of admiration, of a fierce, protective tenderness that was so much deeper and purer than anything she had ever known. It was not the fearful, obligatory emotion she had been taught was love. This was something else entirely, something real. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her hand. It was the first time she had ever touched him out of pure choice, a touch born not of necessity or fear, but of a simple, profound desire for closeness. She laid her palm gently against the rough, stubbled skin of his cheek. His skin was hot, but underneath the fever, she could feel the solid, living warmth of him. The touch was an anchor, a quiet declaration in the lonely cabin. "I am here. I am not leaving." His muttering quieted. The restless movement of his head ceased, as if her touch had called him back from whatever dark place he had wandered to. His eyes slowly fluttered open. They were glassy with fever, but they were focused. They were focused on her. He looked at her hand on his cheek for a long moment, then up into her eyes. The firelight cast a soft, golden glow on her face, illuminating the tracks of tears she hadn't even realized she had shed. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, a secret meant only for the two of them in the heart of the vast, sleeping wilderness. "I always thought I was afraid of men," she breathed, the words a confession of a lifetime of fear. "I thought their strength was something to be run from, something that would hurt me and cage me." She looked down at him, at his wounded, feverish form, a man who had used his strength only to shield her. But maybe I was just waiting for one who didn't make me afraid. The truth of the words settled in the quiet room, as real and as solid as the log walls around them. It was the deepest truth she had. Luke's expression didn't change, but a new light came into his eyes, a deep, knowing softness. He slowly lifted his right hand, the one that wasn't wounded. He didn't take her hand. He didn't touch her cheek. He simply raised one long, calloused finger and laid it gently against her lips. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt through her entire being. It was a gesture of incredible tenderness, a silent acknowledgement of her confession. It sealed her words, honored them. He held his finger there for a moment, and she could feel the faint tremor of his own weakness. His voice was a low, rough rasp, but the edges had been softened by something new, something gentle. "You still think cowboys are rough?" The question was a quiet echo of their conversation on the porch, what felt like a lifetime ago. It was a gentle tease, a reminder of the woman she had been when she arrived, a terrified, suspicious creature who saw danger in every shadow. She looked at him now, at the man who had shown her what true strength was not the power to dominate, but the courage to protect. A small, weary smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a genuine, heartfelt thing that reached all the way to her eyes. "I think," she whispered against his finger, her voice thick with emotion, "I was wrong. The fever broke, and with it, the last of the winter in Luke's soul seemed to thaw. His healing was a slow, quiet process that measured the passing of autumn. The vibrant greens of the valley gave way to the gold and rust of the changing leaves, and the air grew crisp with the promise of cold to come. Clara was his constant shadow, his nurse, his companion. She changed his bandages, cooked his meals, and read to him from a tattered copy of Shakespeare she found in the bottom of his chest, her voice a soft, steady murmur against the growing silence of the world outside. As his strength returned, their roles began to blend. He taught her how to read the tracks of deer in the soft earth, how to tell the weather from the clouds that gathered over the high ridges. She taught him about the world she came from, a world of books and quiet conversations, a world he had only ever seen from a great and lonely distance. Winter came and enclosed them in a world of white. The snow fell in thick, silent blankets, muffling all sound, isolating their small cabin from the rest of the world. The valley became their entire universe. They were two souls adrift in a vast sea of white, and they had only each other for an anchor. The close confines of the cabin did not chafe. They nurtured. A new, domestic intimacy grew between them, woven from the simple threads of daily life. They moved around each other in a silent, practiced dance, their days marked by the scent of baking bread, the sharp bite of pine smoke, and the soft glow of the firelight on the log walls. The touches came, at first, by accident, a brushing of hands as she passed him a plate, his arm steadying her as she slipped on a patch of ice by the well. But soon, the accidents became less so. The touches lingered. A hand left for a moment longer than necessary on a shoulder. Fingers that intertwined for a heart-stopping second as they reached for the same log for the fire. They never spoke of it, but each touch was a conversation, a reaffirmation of the promise to be good at not leaving. Then, as it always does, the world turned. The first sign of spring was not a flower, but the sound of dripping water as the iron grip of the frost began to loosen. The snow receded, unveiling a land that was damp and brown and full of a quiet, sleeping energy. The creek began to swell and sing its boisterous song again. The birds returned, their calls a cheerful, welcome intrusion into the long winter's silence. Spring awoke something in Clara, a deep, primal need to put down roots, to bring color and life to this place that had become her sanctuary. One afternoon, while cleaning out the small, dusty pantry, she found it a small, cloth-wrapped package tucked away on a high shelf. Inside was a collection of smaller paper packets, their contents dry and rattling. Seeds. On the front of each was a faded, elegant script, a woman's hand, spelling out the names of flowers, Indian paintbrush, bluebells, evening primrose. They were the legacy of the ghost, the woman who had come before. For a moment, a familiar, hollow ache touched Clara's heart. Then, it was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet continuation. She was not replacing a past. She was planting a future. She took the seeds and the empty, storm-battered window box on the porch and made them her mission. She found a spade and turned the damp, rich soil. Luke watched her from a distance, saying nothing, but a small, quiet smile touched his lips. He watched as she planted the tiny, dormant seeds with a reverence that was almost prayer-like. She was tending not just a garden, but her own hope. As she cultivated life, he turned his attention to resurrecting it. At the far end of the meadow stood the skeleton of an old windmill, its wooden blades broken and askew, its metal workings rusted and seized. It had stood derelict for years, a monument to a past failure. Now, with a new purpose gleaming in his eyes, Luke began the slow, arduous work of repairing it. He hauled the broken blades down and began to painstakingly shape new ones from seasoned pine. He spent days cleaning and oiling the rusted gears. His hands, which she had once thought of as instruments of violence, now working with the patient precision of a watchmaker. The windmill was his own silent declaration. It was a promise of permanence, a promise of a future where there would always be fresh water, a future that was sustainable, a future that was built to last. Their days fell into a new, sun-drenched rhythm. She would tend to her burgeoning garden while he worked on his windmill. The sounds of her spade in the soft earth and his hammer on the hard metal, a kind of music across the meadow. They would meet in the middle for lunch, sitting on a blanket under the warm sun, their shoulders brushing. They would talk of small things the color of a new wildflower, the progress he had made on a stubborn gear. But beneath the surface of their simple words, a deeper conversation was taking place. Every flower she planted was a vote of confidence in their future. Every turn of his wrench was a promise to provide for it. The day the windmill was finished, a fresh breeze was blowing down from the mountains. Together, they hoisted the last new blade into place. Luke made the final adjustments, then stepped back, slowly, hesitantly at first. The great wooden blades began to turn. They caught the wind, creaking to life, and began to spin, faster and faster. A great, powerful heartbeat in the center of the valley. A few minutes later, a gush of clean, clear water poured from the pipe into the stock tank. Clara laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Luke looked at her face alight with happiness, and the last of the shadows in his own soul seemed to retreat. He had not just fixed a piece of machinery, he had brought life back to a forgotten corner of their world. He had done it for her. He had done it for them. That evening, they ate on the porch. The air was soft and fragrant with the scent of the primroses that had begun to bloom in Clara's window box. They were a splash of cheerful, defiant yellow against the weathered gray wood. They ate in their usual comfortable silence, but it was a silence brimming with unspoken emotions. As Luke reached for a piece of bread, his hand covered hers where it rested on the table. It was no accident. His fingers were warm and strong. He didn't pull away, and neither did she. They simply sat there for a long moment, Their hands joined, the simple touch a vow more powerful than any words. Later, as the stars began to appear in the deep, velvet sky, a profound sense of peace settled over Clara. She looked at this quiet, steady man beside her. She looked at the small, sturdy cabin, at the flowers blooming on her porch, at the windmill turning faithfully in the meadow. This was her home. This was her life. A life she had not been given, but one she had fought for, and one she had built, hand in hand with the man beside her. She leaned her head against his good shoulder. It felt strong, solid. It felt like coming home. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, a breath of sound in the vast, quiet dark. I've never slept next to anyone. The confession was the last piece of her old life, the final, vulnerable truth of her isolation and fear. She was giving it to him, laying it at his feet as a final act of trust. Luke didn't answer right away. He simply shifted his arm, wrapping it gently around her shoulders, pulling her closer. A low, soft laugh rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, warm affection. He leaned his head down, his lips brushing against her hair. His voice was a deep, gentle murmur against her ear. "Now you have." The words were simple, but they held the entire world. They were an acknowledgement of the night of the storm, of their hands linked in the darkness. They were a gentle erasure of her lonely past and a quiet, profound promise for all the nights to come. He was not just a man she was sitting beside. He was the man who had been there. He was the man who would stay. No one said, "I love you." There was no need. Love was not a word to be spoken. It was a truth to be lived. It was in the blooming flowers and the turning windmill. It was in the shared silence and the lingering touch of a hand. It was in the way he looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, quiet reverence. And it was in the way she leaned against him, finally safe, finally home, as the stars wheeled silently overhead in the vast, western sky. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in. Feel free to share your thoughts on Clara and Luke's journey. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really want to help our stories be heard, please press that hype button to share it with more listeners like you.